People tend to forget how much an old woman sees. They look at my hands first, the thin skin, the blue veins, the way my fingers curl a little slower than they used to when I reach for my coffee mug. They notice how I pause before answering questions, like I'm searching for words I've misplaced. They assume time has worn holes in my memory. I don't rush to correct them. At 80 years old, I've learned something most people never do. Being underestimated is a kind of freedom. When people think you don't see clearly anymore, they stop hiding things. My name is Dorothy, but everyone has called me Dot since I was a little girl. I've lived in this same suburban neighborhood for 42 years now. Same white fence out front, same narrow driveway where Frank used to park a little crooked no matter how many times I teased him about it. Same rose bushes we planted together back when our hands were steadier and our plans felt endless. From the outside, my life looks calm, predictable, the kind of quiet people associate with age. But quiet doesn't mean empty. Most mornings, I wake before the sun. I always have. Old habits stick around longer than people do. I sit at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that's usually gone lukewarm by the time I remember to drink it. I watch the neighborhood stretch awake through my window. Garage doors lift like sleepy eyelids. Dogs tug their owners down the sidewalk. Delivery trucks hum past at the same time every day. And next door, Mrs. Carter waters her flowers like she's guarding secrets in the soil. Mrs. Carter has been my neighbor nearly as long as Frank was my husband. We've shared casseroles, spare keys, and the kind of conversations that happen when two women have lived long enough to stop pretending everything is fine. She notices things, always has, but she knows better than to announce it. That's important later. At the time, though, everything still looked normal. Or at least normal enough that no one else questioned it. Ryan is my only son. He's a good man, he always has been. Not perfect, nobody raised in this world is, but kind at heart. He used to call me every Sunday morning without fail, just to check in, just to talk, sometimes about nothing at all. That changed after Jennifer married. Everyone calls her Jen. She came into our family with a bright smile and a firm handshake, confident, organized, the kind of woman who remembers names and corrects people gently when they get details wrong. At first, I admired that about her. I thought she'd bring balance to Ryan's life. He's always been more heart than structure. At the wedding, she hugged me tight and called me Mom before the night was over. I remember thinking how lucky we all were. Looking back, that was the first mistake. Not hers, mine. The changes didn't come all at once. They never do. If they did, people might notice. At first, Jen was just helpful. She organized family gatherings, reminded Ryan about birthdays, offered to take care of things when I looked tired. It all sounded thoughtful, responsible. She'd say things like, "Don't worry about it, Dot, we've got you." And I believed her. After Frank passed, the house felt bigger than it used to, quieter. Ryan came by more often then. Jen did too. She brought groceries, cleaned my kitchen, rearranged my pantry so things were easier to reach. I thanked her every time. Gratitude comes naturally when you're raised the way I was. But slowly, I noticed something. She didn't ask anymore. She decided. One afternoon, she sat across from me at my dining table, legs crossed neatly, phone resting face down, like it might buzz at any moment. She talked while I stirred sugar into my tea, explaining changes she'd already made. "We simplified some things for you," she said, smiling, "just to make life easier." Easier for who, I wondered. She explained my mail had been reorganized, bills consolidated, some paperwork handled. Her tone was calm, professional, like she was giving a presentation instead of asking permission. I nodded the way people expect an old woman to nod, slow, agreeable, quiet. Inside, something shifted. Not anger, awareness. I started paying closer attention after that. Not in a suspicious way, just awake. Jen began speaking for me in conversations. If someone asked how I was doing, she'd answer before I could. "She's doing great, aren't you, Dot?" And I'd smile. She'd remind Ryan about things we already discussed, conversations I didn't remember having, plans I hadn't agreed to. When I questioned her, she'd tilt her head slightly, soften her voice.
"Oh, Dot, we talked about this." She said it with such confidence I almost doubted myself. Almost. One evening, I was walking slowly down the hallway toward the living room when I heard their voices. I didn't mean to listen, but old floors creak in familiar ways, and if you stand just right, you can hear without being heard. "She doesn't really understand all this stuff anymore," Jen said, quietly, calm, reasonable. "It's not her fault. She's just at that age." There was a pause. Ryan sighed, long and tired. "Yeah, I guess you're right." That hurt more than I expected, not because Jen said it, because my son believed it. I rested my hand against the wall and stood there longer than I should have. My heart didn't race, my breath didn't catch. It was more like something settled into place. This is how it happens, I thought. Not with cruelty, with convenience. From that moment on, I said even less. I listened more. Jen grew comfortable, confident. She brought papers sometimes. Documents, she said, were just formalities, nothing to worry about. I read every word, slowly, carefully. I let my eyes linger long enough for her to assume I didn't fully understand. I asked small questions, the kind that make people underestimate you further. She answered quickly, patiently, like a teacher correcting a child. She didn't notice what I noticed, that some details didn't match, that dates shifted, that stories changed depending on who was listening. Mrs. Carter asked me one morning if everything was all right. We were standing by the fence watching a delivery truck struggle to park straight. "You seem quieter lately," she said gently. I smiled and told her I was tired. She nodded like she believed me, but her eyes said otherwise. At night, when the house settled and the streetlights flickered on, I sat alone in my armchair and thought, not with fear, not with anger, with clarity. I replayed conversations, noted patterns, remembered details, names, words, tones. People assume memory fades evenly with age. It doesn't. Some things stay sharp as glass. Jen thought I was weak because I didn't push back. She thought I didn't notice because I didn't react. She thought silence meant surrender. But silence can be a strategy, and mine had already begun. I smiled when she spoke. I nodded when she decided. I thanked her for helping, and all the while I held on to something she didn't realize she'd given me. Not leverage, truth. And truth, given enough time, has a way of standing on its own. If you're wondering when I decided to stop observing and start preparing, that came later, much later. It happened the day Jen crossed a line she didn't even know existed, right in front of me, and assumed I didn't understand a word she said. That was the moment everything changed, and she never saw it coming.
There's a moment when helpfulness quietly changes its name. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't raise its voice. One day it's kindness, and the next day it's authority, and if you weren't paying attention, you'd swear it had always been that way. That's what happened with Jen. By the time I realized how much ground she'd taken, she was walking through my life like she owned the place. Not rudely, not loudly, just confidently, like someone who had already decided the outcome and didn't feel the need to explain it twice. She began calling instead of visiting. "Dot, I took care of that for you," she'd say. Or, "Ryan and I already talked it over." Always talked, never asked. I noticed how my phone rang less often, how Ryan's Sunday calls grew shorter. Sometimes he didn't call at all. When I asked, Jen would smile and say, "Oh, he's just been so busy lately." Busy is another word that hides a lot. She started bringing lists when she visited, not grocery lists, life lists. Things I should stop worrying about, things I didn't need anymore, things that were too much for me now. She'd slide the paper across the table and tap it gently with her finger. "Just ideas," she'd say. But ideas don't usually come with decisions already made. One afternoon, she suggested I shouldn't drive anymore. Not because I'd done anything wrong, not because of an accident, just because she thought it was safer. "You don't really need to," she said. "Ryan can drive you, or I can." I nodded slowly. Inside, I remembered every mile I'd driven alone across this country when I was younger. I remembered teaching Ryan how to parallel park.
I remembered Frank gripping the dashboard like a handle he could steer the world with. But I said nothing, because arguing would have confirmed exactly what she already believed. The house felt different, too. Things moved, drawers rearranged, cabinets shifted, items placed where they made more sense. One afternoon, she couldn't find my important papers, the ones Frank and I had always kept together. I asked Jen about them, casually. "Oh, I organized all that," she said. "It's safer this way." Safer. That word again. She handed me a folder, not the same one. I took it with a smile and thanked her. That night, I went through every page. Some things were missing. It wasn't just about paperwork, it was about presence. Jen started telling stories about me when I was sitting right there. Stories that weren't wrong exactly, just adjusted, smoothed, edited. "She gets confused sometimes," she'd say with a gentle laugh. "She means well, but she forgets." People nodded sympathetically. No one asked me. That's how silence grows heavy. Mrs. Carter noticed. She always did. One morning, she caught me outside struggling with a stuck mailbox key. She reached over without a word and helped me twist it free. "You all right, Dot?" she asked. I told her I was fine. She didn't argue. She just looked at me longer than usual. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "people confuse quiet with consent." Then she walked back to her house like she hadn't said anything important at all. But she had. Jen grew more relaxed as time went on, more certain. She corrected me openly now, finished my sentences, answered questions meant for me. I let her. Confidence makes people careless, and Jen was getting very comfortable. One evening, she sat beside Ryan on my couch, scrolling through her phone while she spoke. "We should probably look into downsizing for Dot," she said casually. "This house is a lot." Ryan hesitated, just for a second. "She loves this house," he said. Jen smiled. "Of course she does, but love doesn't always mean best." She looked at me. "What do you think, Dot?" I smiled back. "I think you've put a lot of thought into it." She beamed. That was answer enough for her. Later that night, I sat alone in the quiet house and listened to the walls. Every home has its own sounds. This one had held laughter, arguments, forgiveness, and grief. I wasn't ready to leave it, and I wasn't going to. Jen began making assumptions aloud. "That's already been handled. We've decided. She won't mind." She never asked if she was right, because no one challenged her. Except me. Quietly. I started writing things down. Dates, conversations, changes. Not out of fear, out of clarity. I kept notes in a small notebook I hid inside an old recipe box, the kind no one thinks to open anymore. I didn't need proof yet. I needed patience. The day Jen truly crossed the line came without warning. She was sitting at my dining table again, sipping coffee she hadn't asked for. She was explaining something, I don't even remember what, when she leaned back and said something that made my stomach go still. "It's probably time we update some things," she said casually, "just to reflect reality." "What reality?" I asked gently. She laughed like I'd told a joke. "Well," she said, lowering her voice, "that you're not really capable of managing everything on your own anymore." She said it so calmly, so confidently, like it was already a fact. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw what she truly believed, that I was already gone. I smiled, not because I agreed, because I understood. From that moment on, I stopped wondering if she underestimated me. She absolutely did, and that meant something important. She wasn't watching me anymore. She thought she'd already won. And that, in my experience, is when people make their biggest mistakes. I didn't confront her, I didn't warn Ryan, I didn't raise my voice. I let things continue, because I wasn't collecting anger, I was collecting time. And soon, very soon, Jen was going to give me exactly what I needed. She just didn't know it yet.
There's a dangerous assumption people make about age. They think memory fades evenly, like a photograph left too long in the sun, that everything softens at the same rate. Names, faces, moments, all drifting away together. That's not how it works. Some memories blur, yes, I'll admit that freely. I forget where I put my glasses more often than I'd like. Sometimes I walk into a room and need a second to remember why I'm there. But other memories? They stay sharp as glass. The important ones. Jen didn't know that about me. She mistook my pauses for confusion, my silence for surrender, my gentleness for weakness. And because she believed that so completely, she stopped being careful. That's when I started to see the cracks. Not all at once, little ones. Hairline fractures in the stories she told, the timelines she adjusted, the details she assumed no one would notice. But I noticed. It started with small contradictions. One day, she told Ryan she'd already discussed something with me. Later, that same afternoon, she explained the same thing again, slightly differently, assuming I wouldn't remember the first version. Another time, she mentioned moving paperwork last month, when I clearly remembered her doing it just a week earlier. Dates matter when you've lived long enough to measure life in seasons instead of years. She didn't realize I was listening with intention now. Every word mattered. I continued my routine. Mornings by the window, afternoons with a book I didn't always read, evenings in my armchair, listening to the house breathe. But behind that calm, I was awake in a way I hadn't been in years. I wrote things down. Not angrily, not obsessively. Simply. Dates. Phrases. Who said what, and who was in the room when they said it. I didn't label it evidence. That would have felt dramatic. I called it remembering. Jen's confidence grew alongside my silence. She began speaking more freely around me, assuming I didn't fully follow along. She talked while scrolling on her phone, half-focused, letting thoughts slip out unfiltered. One afternoon, she mentioned something that stopped me cold. "We'll need to explain this to people carefully," she said. "You know how sensitive they can be." "Who's they?" I asked. She waved her hand lightly. "Everyone. Family, friends. We just don't want anyone getting the wrong idea." About what, I wondered. But I didn't ask. Questions can make people defensive. Silence makes them talk. Ryan was changing too. Not cruelly, just gradually. He deferred to Jen more, looked to her before answering questions, let her finish his thoughts. I could see the man he used to be still there, kind, thoughtful, but buried under layers of convenience. It's easy to let someone else decide when you're tired. I don't blame him. I understand him. Mrs. Carter and I spoke less directly about things, but more meaningfully. Sometimes she'd comment on something small, how often Jen seemed to be around, how quiet Ryan looked lately. She never accused, never suggested. She just observed. And sometimes, observation is enough to remind you that you're not imagining things. The first real mistake Jen made happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because it was garbage day, and the street smelled faintly of cut grass and exhaust. Jen was seated at my table again, papers spread neatly in front of her. "These are just updates," she said lightly. "Nothing major." I adjusted my glasses and leaned closer, taking my time. She sighed, just barely, a flicker of impatience. I caught it. As she talked, she mentioned a conversation she claimed we'd had months ago. She described it confidently, almost casually. But the problem was, that conversation never happened. And even more importantly, the timeline she gave overlapped with a period when I wasn't even in town. I remembered because I'd stayed with my sister that week. We'd watched old movies and laughed ourselves breathless.
It was one of the last good visits before her health declined. Jen couldn't have known that memory was so clear, but it was. I looked up at her and smiled. "Oh yes," I said gently. "I remember." Relief washed over her face. That's when I knew. She was building something on the assumption that I wouldn't challenge her memory with my own. From then on, I tested the pattern quietly. I'd agree with things I knew weren't true, let her repeat herself, let her adjust stories, let her fill in gaps she assumed were empty. Each time, she revealed a little more. Her confidence wasn't built on truth. It was built on my silence. One evening, Ryan and Jen were sitting across from me on the couch. Jen was explaining a decision they'd made together. Ryan nodded along. She glanced at me and said, "You're okay with that, right, Dot? We talked about it." I met Ryan's eyes. Just for a second. He looked unsure. I smiled softly. "If you think it's best." Jen relaxed instantly. Ryan didn't. But he didn't speak either. That night, I wrote longer than usual in my notebook. Not angrily, thoughtfully. I realized then that Jen wasn't just mistaken about my memory. She was mistaken about my patience. The next mistake she made was assuming no one else was paying attention. She spoke too freely in front of Mrs. Carter one afternoon, correcting me sharply when she thought she was being subtle. Mrs. Carter said nothing at the time, just nodded politely. But later that evening, she knocked on my door. "You all right?" she asked again. I told her I was. She studied my face. "You know," she said slowly, "sometimes people talk like they've already decided how the story ends." Then she smiled and went home. I slept better that night, not because things were resolved, because I knew I wasn't alone. Jen's tone shifted after that, more decisive, less careful. She started referring to plans as done deals, started using words like inevitable and necessary. She spoke about my life like a project nearing completion. She had no idea she was revealing her entire hand. The moment she truly sealed her mistake came quietly. She was on the phone one afternoon, standing in my kitchen. She didn't realize I was close enough to hear, or she didn't care. "She doesn't really question things anymore," she said softly to the phone. There was a pause. "No, I'm not worried. She wouldn't even know where to start." I stood there, holding a dish towel, perfectly still. I knew exactly where to start. From that day forward, I stopped reacting at all. I didn't ask questions. I didn't hesitate. I didn't show uncertainty. I became exactly what Jen believed I was, and that made her careless in ways she couldn't undo. People think revenge requires action. Sometimes all it requires is letting someone finish what they've started. And Jen was getting very close. She just didn't realize that every word she spoke now was being remembered, not by someone confused, but by someone patient enough to wait for the truth to surface on its own. And it was already beginning to do exactly that.
There's a point where confidence stops being quiet. It starts to stretch out, take up space, assume permission it was never given. That's where Jen was now. She moved through my home like a manager doing a final walkthrough. Not rude, never rude, but purposeful. She rearranged without asking, answered my phone when it rang, opened my mail before I even knew it had arrived. And every time she'd smile and say, "I figured you wouldn't mind." She was right about one thing. I didn't mind, because every step she took without asking told me exactly who she thought she was and who she thought I wasn't. Ryan trusted her. That part hurt, but I understood it. Trust grows quietly, just like control does.
He'd come over less often now, and when he did, his visits felt rushed. His eyes drifted to his phone. His answers came slower, like he was waiting for permission that never needed to be asked. Jen noticed it too. She started speaking for him. "We've decided," she'd say. "Ryan agrees. That's what works best for all of us." All of us. It's amazing how often that phrase leaves someone out. The first real slip came on a Sunday afternoon. They were both at my house, sitting at the table. Jen was explaining plans for an upcoming family gathering, one she'd already arranged without telling me. "You won't need to worry about hosting anymore," she said cheerfully. "It's just too much." Ryan nodded, distracted. I looked at him, then at her. "I didn't say I didn't want to host," I said gently. Jen laughed, just a little too quickly. "Oh, Dot, I know, but this way is easier." There it was again. Easier. She didn't wait for agreement, she just kept talking. That's when I noticed something important. She wasn't checking my reactions anymore. She assumed them. From that day on, Jen stopped explaining herself in detail. She summarized instead. Decisions were delivered, not discussed. And when she spoke, she used the tone people use when they believe the conversation is already over. I let her, because confidence has a way of loosening people's grip on the truth. One afternoon, Mrs. Carter and I sat on my porch watching the clouds move slow and heavy across the sky. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then she said, "You ever notice how some people talk louder when they think no one's listening closely?" I smiled. "I've noticed," I said. She nodded. That was all. Jen started leaving things around. Papers, notes, her phone, unlocked, face up on the counter while she stepped outside to take calls. She didn't worry anymore. She assumed I couldn't follow. I didn't worry. She was wrong. I didn't snoop. I didn't dig. I didn't need to. People reveal plenty when they stop guarding themselves. One evening, she sat across from me and said something that would have terrified me months ago. She said, "We might need to explain some changes to people soon, just so everyone's prepared." "Prepared for what?" I asked calmly. She smiled like she'd already rehearsed the answer. She said, "For the fact that things are shifting, naturally." Naturally. I nodded. Inside, I memorized every word. The biggest mistake Jen made was assuming time was on her side. She rushed. She wanted things settled, wrapped up, finished. People who rush stop checking details. She spoke to Mrs. Carter one afternoon while I was inside getting tea. I could hear them through the open window. "She's doing all right," Jen said, "but we're keeping an eye on things." Mrs. Carter's voice was calm, neutral. "Oh?" "Yes," Jen continued. "You know how it is at her age." Mrs. Carter didn't argue. She didn't agree either. Later that evening, she came over with a plate of cookies and stayed longer than usual. "You ever notice," she said casually, "how people talk differently depending on who they think they're talking to?" I nodded. "Yes, I have." That night, I slept soundly, because I realized something important. Jen wasn't preparing for a confrontation. She was preparing for an assumption. And assumptions don't stand up well when the truth walks into the room. The final careless moment came quietly. Too quietly. Jen was sitting at my table again, flipping through papers, when she said something she thought was harmless. "It's already basically done. You don't need to worry." I looked up. "Done?" I asked. She smiled. "Taken care of." She didn't realize she just admitted more than she intended. I didn't react. I didn't ask questions. I didn't interrupt. I thanked her. And that's when she fully relaxed. Later that night, I wrote one final note in my notebook. Not long, just one sentence. She thinks I don't understand what's already been decided. I closed the book and placed it back in the recipe box. I didn't need to write anymore. Everything I needed was already in motion. People think the moment of revenge is loud. It isn't. It's quiet. It's the moment when someone realizes the story they've been telling no longer belongs to them. Jen wasn't there yet, but she was close, closer than she knew. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't need my voice to speak for it. It would speak all on its own.
The thing about truth is this: it doesn't need an invitation. It shows up when it's ready, whether the room is prepared for it or not. By the time I stopped writing things down, I already knew how this would end. Not the details, not the exact moment, but the shape of it. I could feel it the same way you feel a storm before the clouds roll in. The air changes, the silence thickens. Jen didn't notice. She was too busy managing outcomes. It started with a small gathering, nothing dramatic, just family and a few neighbors, the kind of afternoon that feels harmless enough to let your guard down. Jen had organized it, of course. She always did now. "It'll be easier on you," she said when she told me, not asked, told. I smiled and agreed. Ryan arrived early that day, looking tired. He hugged me, but it felt distracted, like his mind was already somewhere else. Jen followed close behind him, cheerful and efficient, moving through the house like she was checking items off a list. Mrs. Carter came too. She brought her usual casserole and set it down carefully, giving me a look that lingered just a second longer than polite. She knew something was coming. I think she could feel it too. The afternoon unfolded easily at first. Conversation drifted from weather to work to neighborhood news. Jen spoke confidently, filling pauses, steering topics. People listened. They always do when someone sounds sure of themselves. At one point, someone asked me a question directly. I don't even remember what it was. Before I could answer, Jen jumped in. "Oh, Dot doesn't really keep track of that anymore," she said with a soft laugh. "But we've got it covered." There was a small pause. Not long, just enough. I noticed Ryan shift in his seat. Mrs. Carter looked at me. I smiled and sipped my tea. The turning point didn't come with an argument. It came with a question. One of those innocent questions that sounds harmless until it lands. A neighbor, someone Jen didn't know very well, asked her how long she'd been handling my affairs. "Oh, not that long, just since Dot started needing help." "And when was that?" the neighbor asked. Jen answered without thinking. "A date. A very specific date. The wrong one." I didn't react, but Ryan did. He frowned slightly, just enough. "That's not right," he said. "Mom was still traveling then." Jen laughed it off. "Oh, you know how it is. Time blurs." I felt Mrs. Carter's gaze settle on me again. This time, I met it. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. I could feel it. People were listening differently now, watching more closely. Jen kept talking, explaining, adjusting, and every adjustment made the story wobble just a little more. Later, as people were helping clear dishes, Mrs. Carter spoke up. "Dot," she said gently, "didn't you and Frank set some of that up years ago?" The room quieted, not abruptly, but noticeably. Jen froze for half a second before smiling again. "Oh, that was updated. We handled that." Mrs. Carter tilted her head. "Funny," she said, "because I remember Dot showing me those papers not too long ago. She was very clear about them." Jen's smile tightened.
Ryan looked from one woman to the other, then at me. That was the moment I spoke. Not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly. "I remember," I said. Everyone turned toward me. The room didn't feel hostile. It felt attentive. I remember exactly what Frank and I put in place, and I remember when, and I remember who was there. Jen opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she wasn't sure which version of the story to tell. I didn't accuse. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I just told the truth, calmly, simply, piece by piece. I talked about dates, about conversations, about decisions that had been made long before Jen ever stepped into the picture. I spoke slowly, giving no room for interruption. No one rushed me. Ryan's face changed as I spoke, not with anger, with realization, like something he'd ignored for a long time was finally standing in front of him. Jen stayed very still. When I finished, no one said anything right away. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy. Then Ryan cleared his throat. "Jen," he said carefully, "that's not how you told it." She laughed softly, too softly. "Well, I might have mixed some things up. You know how things get confusing." No one laughed with her. Mrs. Carter broke the silence. "I don't think Dot is the one who's confused," she said kindly. There was no accusation in her voice, just certainty. Jen looked around the room. For the first time, she realized something important. She wasn't controlling the story anymore. After that day, things changed quickly. Not explosively, but decisively. Ryan started asking questions, real ones. He listened, really listened, for a long while. Jen answered carefully now, too carefully. Her confidence was gone, and once confidence cracks, control follows. I didn't push. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't celebrate. I just stepped back and let the truth finish what it had started. A few days later, Ryan came by alone. He sat across from me at the table and looked tired in a different way than before. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have paid more attention." I reached across the table and held his hand. "You were busy," I said. "It happens." He nodded, but his eyes stayed on mine. "I see it now," he said. That was enough. Jen didn't confront me. She didn't need to. She already knew. The story she'd been telling had collapsed, not because I attacked it, but because it couldn't stand up to daylight. People think revenge means watching someone fall. It doesn't. Sometimes it just means watching someone finally see, and that's exactly what was happening. But it wasn't over yet, not completely, because the final lesson wasn't for Jen alone, it was for all of us.
After the truth settles, there's always a pause. Not the awkward kind, not the kind that begs to be filled. It's more like the moment after a bell stops ringing, when the sound is gone, but the air still remembers it. That's how the house felt in the weeks that followed. Calmer, clearer, different. Ryan started coming by again, just like he used to. Not to manage anything, not to check in, just to sit at the table and talk. Sometimes we talked about nothing important at all. Sometimes we talked about Frank. Sometimes we sat in silence that didn't feel heavy anymore. One afternoon, he looked around the kitchen and said, "This place still feels like home." I smiled. "That's because it is," I said. He nodded slowly, like he was relearning something he'd always known. Jen kept her distance at first. Not out of anger,
out of uncertainty. She didn't know where she stood anymore, and that kind of not knowing makes people careful. When she did come by, she was polite, quieter. She asked before doing things now. Actually asked, "Would you like me to? Is it okay if?" I always answered kindly, because this was never about punishing her, it was about balance. We never had a dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no emotional speeches. Life isn't a movie, and real consequences rarely announce themselves. Instead, things simply shifted. Ryan handled conversations directly with me again. Decisions slowed down, explanations became clearer, and Jen stopped speaking for me altogether. That alone told me everything I needed to know. One afternoon, Mrs. Carter came over with lemonade and sat beside me on the porch. The sun was warm, the street quiet. "You all right?" she asked, like she always had. "I am," I said, honestly. She nodded. "You handled that with grace," she said after a moment. I laughed softly. "No, I handled it with patience. There's a difference." Jen eventually apologized. Not all at once, not perfectly, but sincerely enough. "I didn't realize how much I was overstepping," she said one evening, her hands folded in her lap. "I thought I was helping." "I know," I replied. That was the truth. She hadn't set out to hurt me. She'd set out to control a situation she didn't fully understand, and in doing so, she forgot I was still very much present. I forgave her. Not because she asked, because I was done carrying it. Forgiveness isn't about erasing what happened. It's about choosing not to let it shape what comes next. Life settled into a new rhythm. I kept my routines, my mornings by the window, my evenings in the armchair. The rose bushes still bloomed out front, stubborn as ever. And Jen learned something important, something I hope stays with her, that quiet doesn't mean powerless, that age doesn't mean absence, that kindness is not the same as weakness. People ask me sometimes how I stayed so calm through all of it. The truth is simple. I've lived long enough to know that storms don't always need to be chased away. Some of them pass on their own if you stop feeding them. I didn't need to fight. I just needed to remember who I was. If there's one thing I want people to understand, it's this. Strength doesn't always raise its voice. Wisdom doesn't always argue. And revenge, the real kind, isn't about making someone hurt. It's about standing still long enough for the truth to catch up. If you feel comfortable, I'd appreciate it if you left a like on this video. It helps these quiet stories reach the people who might need them most. You can subscribe to the channel if you'd like to hear more stories like this. Stories about love, endurance, and the things we carry longer than we should. And if you want to, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read them, truly. Knowing this story traveled farther than my living room gives me more comfort than you might imagine. Thank you for sitting with me. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people you love.